Well, thank you for joining today. It's such a pleasure to introduce Nia Wassink, who will be speaking today. Nia has been a partner with SVP Boulder. She says till 2017. When I was looking in the files, it seemed to say that you joined in 2016. Was there like some sort of like bonus tryout year, or are our files incorrect?
Your files are incorrect.
Excellent. We will correct those. So before that time, Nia was an executive director and an investee, an organization that was an investee of Social Venture Partners, and that was Boulder Voices for Children, or CASA. Nia is now the owner and principal of Mission Launch, a Boulder County-based nonprofit consulting firm focusing on fundraising, board governance, and equity. And Mission Launch strives to equip nonprofits with the skills and tools they need to take their mission to the next level while encouraging smart philanthropy and volunteerism. She sits on the board of AFP Colorado, the Association of Fundraising Professionals, and also continues to serve at CASA as a volunteer. Let's see, I added some other things. Nia lives with her husband, Colin, in Longmont, and he's a wildland firefighter. And just personally to say that, Nia has been one of my go-tos from understanding the pulse of the nonprofit sector of Boulder County. And her experience and insight has been an incredible support to me as I took on this role leading SVP. And I just feel so happy to have you share what you have to share with us today, Nia, so welcome.
Thanks, Josh. Nice to see y'all today. I am really excited to dive in on this subject in the next 53 minutes. I'm going to warn you up front, it's a little data heavy, but I'm going to explain the data, make it bite-sized. More than anything, though, that's to keep me off my soapbox, make sure it's all really grounded in fact and reality, because as Josh just described, and for anybody who knows me, I love nonprofits, and so I think about this stuff a lot. But please, if you have questions, unmute yourself, jump in. I'll try to monitor the chat. I'm not always fully successful at that, so do not fear about interrupting me at any point. We're going to have lots of great stuff to go over today. And I'm going to start off the slideshow, which I will also make sure the SVP staff get at the end of this so they can send it over to you. You don't have to worry about trying to take notes or anything like that, especially while you're all enjoying your lunch. So I also just want to take a moment of reflection. This is basically the first thing I've done that's been productive in the last 2 days. Been mourning along with the rest of my community, and it's been hard and emotional, and at the same time also really highlights the needs around philanthropy in a lot of ways. So I just want to take a moment and say I'm with you all, and those of you who have been to other presentations might notice I'm not on my game today, and I'm going to say that's okay. So what we're covering today, first off, our US philanthropic trends. What does it look like in America at large? We're going to talk about 2020 specifically, because I'm sure as you all knew and experienced and saw, there are big changes both in the nonprofit sector, but also in philanthropy itself. And then we're going to drill it down local and look at what's happening in Boulder County, what's not working, and what we can do to start making some changes there. Quick note. So if you are looking through SVP's documentation, we say a lot of great things about what we do in terms of philanthropy. And we typically mean both the volunteer side of philanthropy as well as the financial. Today, we're just focusing in on the financial side of philanthropy. The volunteerism piece, that's a whole nother session that we can do at some other point, but today we're talking about the money. So to get you thinking, get you in that space around philanthropy, we're going to do quick breakout groups. So I want you to think about the last time you made a contribution. Could be a contribution you make regularly, monthly, could just be something recent that really made a difference for you. You're going to go into small groups, talk about why you chose to give and how it made you feel. You don't have to disclose the organization, anything like that, just why you chose to make that donation then and how it made you feel. All right, welcome back. Hopefully that was just fun to kind of reminisce and think about the amazing things that you do with your own philanthropy and how amazing it makes you feel. I often do training on fundraising, and I always start with that same activity because people forget that fundraising is what elicits those feelings. And so similarly, as we're talking about the issues with philanthropy, we should remember that it still does a lot of good and it still makes us feel really good at the same time. So let's get into it. So before we talk about the financial side, let's just talk nonprofits. It's a big sector here in the United States. We have over 1.5 million. That was back in 2016, which is the most recent data we have. My guess is in the last 5 years, we've seen that number increase pretty significantly. And I just love this piece here. If the global nonprofit sector, so not just US, NGOs, everything else, if it were a country, we'd have the 16th largest economy in the world. So really a force more than anything. So I would love just anybody, popcorn in, what do you think the purpose is of the nonprofit sector in the US? I know it's a big question.
I think part of it could be to cover things that the government doesn't take care of.
Yeah.
That's what I say too, Eric. Yes. In many other countries where socialism is, more predominant, there's the social safety nets are much stronger. And living in Spain half the year, most of the time, I do see that. And my friends, talk to me a lot about that. It isn't really as black and white as it appears. Their social safety nets are really not that safe, especially now. But it is true that they have fewer nonprofits because so much of what our nonprofits do is being done by the governments.
Perfect. I could not have asked for a better response from you two that's going to tee up this conversation. It's really important to think about your nonprofit sector in relationship to the government of that country, because it is very true that in the US, we have an incredibly robust nonprofit sector. And a big part of that is because so many of those direct services are provided by nonprofits instead of the government. So spot on. Thank you. Oops, went too far. So next question, again, anybody, what's the purpose of philanthropy in relationship to the sector?
Provides most of its funding.
Yeah. Spot on, Peter. Thanks. Anybody else want to?
Yeah, it's Megan. I also think that it's a way for community to, have ownership in the way that, have this ownership and this stake in the mission and the work of a nonprofit in their community, or nationally or statewide, but I'm mainly thinking local, whether they're giving, small amounts or medium amounts or large amounts or giving their time. I think philanthropy is a way for them to really connect with those nonprofits and missions and make a difference in their communities.
Yeah, absolutely. It can make it very local. And if philanthropy is done right, it can be very democratizing through that local philanthropy as well. Absolutely. Thanks.
That said, Nia, I do have a question. Maybe you're going to address it in this. And I understand what Megan's saying, and I do agree. But one question that I do have is because I hear a lot about philanthropy, especially on NPR, where the programming is so much supported by foundations of very wealthy individuals, rather than, the grassroots coming from the community. So I know you're going to address that. I just wanted to be sure it happened.
Great question, Diane. And you're right. We'll address pieces of that. And at the end, if I haven't addressed it fully, let me know. We'll talk about it some more. So this is just a quick look at philanthropy over the last 30 years that we have data on. Most of the data you're going to see today is from 2019. We do not yet have full 2020 data on what philanthropy looked like, which I think will be very telling. So over the last 30 years from 1979, wait, that's not 30 years. I'm still thinking that the 70s were 30 years ago. Okay, I'm going to check my time understanding for a minute, recalculate that briefly. But you can see overall, philanthropy continues to increase. During this period of time, the only times that we saw declines in giving were 3 specific years. So in 1989, in 2008, and 2009. Otherwise, philanthropy either remained steady or increased over time. And obviously, you can see during the periods that we had recessions, obviously there were some changes, but it's continued to be really strong and continue to grow. Here's where the philanthropy comes from. So again, this is all 2019 data. So we've got 69% of all philanthropy coming from individuals, 17% coming from foundations, 10% from bequests, so that's basically individual giving, but after life, and then 5% from corporations. This individual section continues to be the strongest. I would say within this pie chart, we have not seen significant changes over the last 1 to 2 decades. It's all basically been this mix of where funding comes from. Was there a question that I've just missed? Okay, great. Now, the back end of that is where the money goes to, of course. So if that's where it's coming from, here's where it goes. The largest section of the pie, almost a third, goes to religious institutions, 29%. And that's a really interesting one because we actually don't have much data on religious giving from the institutions themselves because they don't have the same sort of reporting requirements as other nonprofits. So this is self-reported from individuals, whether it's through their taxes or through survey responses. The rest of this is also then confirmed by the institutions saying how they were funded that year. So after religion, we then have education. Again, in the US, where most of our universities, our colleges are nonprofit. And then even when we have public school, we often have public school foundations that support that. We have a lot of funding that goes into education. The next is human services. So 12% of all philanthropy goes to human services. On the back end of that, 35% of all nonprofits are human services though. So in terms of proportionality, they're getting significantly less funding than the number of organizations out there seeking funding. From there, we've got gifts to grant making foundations. Health, again, most hospitals in the US are nonprofit. Public societal benefit, that's a conglomeration of a lot of things, but one area that we've seen that has really grown in there is a lot of donor advised funds are considered public or societal benefit, especially any of the ones held in the big organizations, Schwab, the National Trust, those are all calculated there in the public societal benefit portion of this. Arts, cultures, and humanities, international affairs, which is a much smaller section, environment, and then individuals. And individuals is a relatively new piece of this pie, mostly because we now have a way for people to give to individuals. We've got GoFundMe's and we've got direct recipient programs in a way that we never have in the past. So all of this represents almost $450 billion in giving going to these organizations. It's a lot of money that we're seeing distributed.
Nia, before you go forward, can I back you up to the other circle that had where's government there?
So government isn't considered philanthropy.
But, oh, I see. Okay. So what's that considered? Because, being on boards, seeing, who our donors are, a lot of times it's Boulder County or state or even federal grants. So what is that if it's not philanthropy?
Government grants, because essentially what you're talking about there is some sort of like contracting. I mean, I know we've got some trickier language around that, but we don't measure it in the same ways. And we also don't have the same data on it because it's coming from those government sources. We're not getting tax returns that shows how that funding is coming out. So it doesn't hit any of our philanthropy numbers.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Any other questions on these 2 charts? If you do want more data on this, this is all from Giving USA. They publish an annual report that talks all about philanthropy, and they've got some really robust citations. So it's basically the gold standard in philanthropy research each year. So this gets to that initial point. how philanthropy and government work together. This is not a perfect chart, but it shows overall government outlays. So that doesn't necessarily just mean grants or contracts to nonprofits. It's what the government spent and philanthropy marked together. So you can see like where government outlays decline in the early 2000s, philanthropy increased. The inverse of that happened during the Great Recession, right? The government spent a lot more money. They invested in programs. We saw philanthropy decline, especially as the markets declined and we had issues there. And now they're starting to track together again. So that does talk to that interplay a little bit of how services are provided and how funding is provided. But what we also know is that neither of those are keeping pace with societal needs, with community needs. So have you looked at our hate crime data lately? It's continuing to increase. How about child homelessness in the US? Continuing to increase. Child poverty, also increasing. Mass incarceration, wealth inequality, right? Like our big societal issues continue to get worse despite funding from philanthropy increasing. It is not keeping pace with the needs of our communities. That's basically the big critique for today. If you take nothing else home, it's that our philanthropy is not making the big differences that we would like for it to, that we've said it has been over the last 50 years. We're not seeing the big changes being made. Before I jump into 2020, I want to pause for a second and see how that resonates. Does that make sense? Does it hit you? Any questions coming up?
Yeah. You showed the graph that illustrated philanthropy going up in inflation adjusted dollars. And so what you're saying is that the societal needs, if we could plot them in some sort of equivalent graph, would have a steeper slope.
Exactly. Yep. Probably the closest connection there is the wealth inequality, where we're seeing families pushed into poverty despite continuing to work, where wages haven't kept pace. And we see poverty being tied to so many of these societal issues. So for me, that's probably the closest indicator that we could chart together, but it's obviously a bit more complex than that.
No, these aren't the only issues either. I mean, with
right.
The arts is obviously not there. I mean, other societal needs, healthcare, and so on. So that's even on top of what you've presented there. Those are really critical ones you presented, but there are others.
Oh yeah.
That other people would think were equally critical.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was not meant to be an exhaustive list at all, except just some of the initial ones, but you're so right there. We often talk about philanthropy too, in terms of creating thriving communities. So if we're truly thriving, we've got a vibrant arts community, we've got museums, we have access to culture, and all of that is a really important part of philanthropy, and it's lagging. Dan, did you have something there?
Yeah.
Oh.
I'd like to say,
and then Renelle.
It would be interesting. Oh, Renelle, I'm sorry, I didn't want to cut you off.
No, Diane, you go, and then Renelle's going to be next.
Okay. So noticing that only 5% of it came from corporations, it would also be really interesting to have a slide in there that talked about corporate profits going up, and not increasing that 5% when they did, which to me is an absolute travesty and disgrace. I'm sure a lot of people feel that way, but it would still be good to know that in terms of the numbers.
Diane, I love that. I'm writing that down because I want to plot that chart. I think you're right. That would be really interesting. I have the numbers in terms of corporate giving, and it has not exceeded that 5% ever. Like I think we went from 4.5 to 4.7 during a period of time, but that data you're talking about right there would be fascinating. Thank you. Renelle, how about you?
I guess my question is maybe too big even to get into, but you know, on one hand, I mean, we've seen a lot of the same, you know, data, particularly through the pandemic on the wealth gap and inequity. And, you know, my question is always around the root causes. So that's sort of one piece of it. But the second piece would be, we have plenty of money in this country. We could solve all these problems if we choose to, but we choose not to. But from a philanthropy standpoint, is there any research, you know, in your field that sort of says, you know, if we were to put all this money into education, we could actually solve some of these root issues? Because it does feel like, if you play devil's advocate, you know, we've been throwing money away for a long time. I wouldn't say throwing away is not the right term, but we're spending a lot of money, but we're not making progress. So what would you say to that?
It's the reason that I want to crawl under my desk and cry most days. But I mean, you bring up such a good point. I don't know that there is any one solution. It's a systemic issue, right? Like it speaks to our tax code. It speaks to our culture around philanthropy. It speaks to our regulation of philanthropic tools. Like all of this together has created this perfect storm in many ways in the US, where now we are so far behind that figuring out the path forward is hard.
Because we have the resources, you know, between the government, you know, the philanthropy, I mean, we have the resources. I think it's just, how do we deploy them, and how do we fix some of these root causes that keep, you know, all of these numbers going in the wrong direction when it comes to poverty or homelessness or.
Yep. That'll be our next lunch topic.
Yeah,
we'll figure out how to fix
I think that would be great. Yeah, good.
So another comment, if no one else is going to make a comment, anyone else going to comment right now? Okay, I'm sorry, Julia, go.
Sure, absolutely. In the same vein, the shifting of responsibility, I think from the Bush years to nonprofits from the government, I think has increased the need of nonprofits and probably spread their funds thin.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, we have some really interesting data too on giving by political affiliation. Republicans actually fund their affiliated causes way better than Democrats do. And I think probably part of that is the assumption of what government's role should be. But if you look at like the states that have the highest levels of philanthropy, they are red states. And a lot of that funding is going to very specific causal areas related to that. The states with the worst philanthropic funding are blue states. So there's some really interesting interplays there that we can also work to start shifting and having these kind of conversations. I mean, I was not expecting us to have this conversation, and I'm loving that we are, because it really is a much larger problem. When I get to solutions on the last slide, it's not about this stuff. It's like what we can do individually. And at the end of the day, we need these larger fixes to be talked about and legislation that's going to actually allow us to move forward. Diane, did you have something then?
Yes. Okay. First of all, I'll comment on what you just commented on. And that is, you know, it would be really interesting to know in those Republican states where their interests lie, because intuitively, maybe I'm wrong about this, but intuitively, I would imagine that a lot of that big percentage that goes to religion is in those states. You know, a lot of that's the Bible Belt. So I think I'm not way off base, but that would be interesting to know where they are contributing. I doubt very much that it's social services. I could be wrong, but I don't think so. The other thing I meant to say, coming off a year of an election year, where it's continuing to happen, that I am getting all of these requests constantly now on my phone, in my email, etc., for the next election, is that we are constantly, nonprofits, competing with the money that's going to fund elections and our candidates. And campaign finance reform is a really big issue in terms of that. If we could think of the billions of dollars that were invested in these campaigns and what we could do with that kind of money. I mean, we could solve so many social problems not to mention the really most important one, which is the the crisis, the climate crisis. So I'm saying, there are other things that seem like they're not related, like campaign finance reform, which I think is a really big deal and very related.
Well, Diane, you're teeing me up so lovely, because we're going to be talking about both of those, especially in a Boulder County context, because those are really important. Jen, nice to see your son. I love Zoom cameos. But we're going to be talking about those, because you're right. Like, at the end of the day, there's both the assumption of finite resources, but then there's the reality. And so when we've got some of these other funding priorities, like the significant amount of money that goes into elections in America, we have to talk about it and how it relates to philanthropy that could go elsewhere. So let's jump into 2020 though, because we could talk about this all day, and I've got some more good data for you. So obviously 2020 was a whole different ball game for everybody, but we definitely saw it in nonprofits and philanthropy. I'd love just one or two people, any reflections that you have, anything you saw in the nonprofit sector.
I'll jump in and say that I think anything dealing with food banks was extremely well funded.
Yeah, direct support, absolutely. Thanks, Alexa. Anybody else? Anything you saw happening?
Well, I don't have any good data on this, but it seems like people tended to be more generous with their contributions just because everybody was suffering so much. People who could afford it were probably more generous with their contributions than they would have been in the past.
Yeah, absolutely, Dennis. Was there somebody else jumping in there?
Yeah, this is Shauna. I was just going to add that obviously healthcare did well. What I also saw was anybody that did a specific COVID relief fund, they kind of fared better too. The ones obviously that continued fundraising, putting the word out there versus those who just kind of sat back.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great point. So we don't have the full Giving USA data yet. I want to caveat this, but initial indicators have us at 10% increase in overall philanthropy in 2020. We have never seen an increase like that before. Like this blows all of our prior data out of the water in terms of, those little like notch ups that we saw year over year. A 10% increase in philanthropy. That's huge. And we're right, it wasn't universally applied. So first off, one of the big things we saw was actually a call on foundations to shift the way they were doing business. That meant looking at their grant making processes. Is it burdensome for your grantees? Is it exploiting power dynamics between you as the funder and the grantee? Are you only funding certain types of grantees? 2020 was the first year that I really heard public conversations about the fact that most foundation funding was going to white-led organizations, even if they were serving communities of color. Like that white savior organization was getting a lot more grant funding than the grassroots organizations run by people in that community, serving people in that community. And foundations were called on to do that analysis and really think about how their funding was impacting that. We also saw huge calls on wealthy individuals to increase their philanthropy. This came in a lot of different forms. We had a lot of peers stepping up and saying, I'm giving a certain percentage of my wealth. I'm calling on others in this bracket to do the same. But there was a real push, especially on those that were benefiting financially during the pandemic, to deploy those dollars quickly and turn them around for philanthropy. Whether that happened is a very different story, but there was a big call for it. We also saw major calls for regulation and change for gift-making tools like donor-advised funds and real transparency around all of this. For those of you who aren't familiar with donor-advised funds, it's almost like a savings account that a donor can use. You put your money into it, you get your tax deduction at the time that the money goes into the donor advised fund, and then you can use it to distribute to different organizations. Well, donor advised funds have been increasing in assets pretty significantly over the last decade. And in 2020, people were saying, deploy those funds. Start clearing out your donor advised funds. We don't want them sitting there for the next generation because the issues are happening right now. So we saw things like Half My DAF, which was a pledge that a DAF holder was doing to try to get others to literally get half their DAFs out their door and actually into the hands of nonprofits who are doing the work. Jack Dorsey is the CEO of Twitter, formerly Square. He is a billionaire and made some real pledges around giving in 2020, but then kept a publicly open Google spreadsheet of where his funds were going. And that's the kind of transparency that people were requesting. Great that you're deploying money, but where's it actually going to? Are you doing the work to figure out who's in the weeds, who's doing the work? We saw that again when Mackenzie Scott gave away millions and millions of dollars in the fall. Similarly, people were like, how did you come up with this list? What sort of vetting? And she gave to a number of organizations that were led by BIPOC communities that were really grassroots and doing the work, which is a big shift. You know, traditionally we see big philanthropic dollars going to a lot of universities and going to a lot of national organizations. You know, if there's a disaster, you'll see millions going to the American Red Cross. And in 2020, people were turning that on its head and saying, the American Red Cross is great, but I actually live in this community that's impacted. I want my local nonprofits to get these funds. And then that increased focus on proximity. So not just organizations led by BIPOC folks if they're serving BIPOC communities, but people that actually have leaders that are in those spaces. So if you are a homelessness organization, do you have clients or former clients on your board? Do you have an executive director who is from this community, who knows this community? There's a real focus on ensuring that basically services are provided in a way that are really focused with the client at the center, instead of kind of these external approaches. You know, I'm going to come in and tell you how to run homelessness in your community. Racial justice, obviously, we saw a ton of funding going to organizations that were on the ground doing racial justice work. And then the direct services, Alexa, like you were saying, where we saw food banks, shelters, those kinds of organizations really getting a lot of funds shifted to them in ways that we hadn't seen in the past. And at the same time, at this point, we know that 1/3 of nonprofits are on the brink of collapse. So here's where that disparity in philanthropy comes into play. The organizations that are most likely to falter right now are a lot of our arts and culture organizations, or any that have earned revenue that was a key way of getting revenue that couldn't happen. So think about like summer camps, organizations that couldn't provide their direct services in the pandemic environment, couldn't figure out a way to pivot them. Those are the ones that we have a real risk of losing right now in this pandemic space. In this stat, this 1/3 just came out in January. So it's pretty recent and relevant from that survey that we've got a lot of organizations that are really concerned about their continued survival. So again, I'm going to pause just real quick, see what questions that look back at 2020 brings up for folks.
I have a question, Nia. And,
yeah.
You know, every sector has inefficiency. So I know that what you just said, you know, is mainly negative, obviously, for the sector. But, you know, is there anything positive that will come out of this in terms of creating more efficiency in the sector?
Yeah, I mean, I think whenever there's any kind of economic issue, there's always going to be conversations about mergers and acquisitions within nonprofits. And we certainly know that there are some organizations that are duplicative, and any organization that's providing a duplicative service is going to be on the edge of financial starvation after a year like 2020. So there will probably be some consolidation. The biggest concern, though, is that the majority of BIPOC-led organizations, we're talking Black, Indigenous, people of color-led organizations, are very small because of historic funding inequalities. So if those are the organizations that are going to falter, we're going to have even bigger issues as a sector. So that's where like the concerns around consolidation for me hit. I don't want my BIPOC-led organizations being the ones who feel like they have to consolidate because they can't financially survive. Oh, it looks like we got some great conversations happening in the chat. Sorry, I'm just now checking on that.
This also might be a question for later, so feel free to say that you want to table it, but how do you feel like that's going to affect the giving for like this year? Do you think how much of that is going to flow over, or do you think it's unrelated?
Yeah, I think actually a lot of that remains to be seen. There's a current call, especially on foundations, to keep the changes they made in the pandemic and make them permanent. And so a lot of that was having really simplified application processes and reports, allowing for multi-year general operating grants so that the funds aren't restricted, organizations can rely on them. So it's basically saying you made these moves to streamline processes in the midst of a crisis. Well, kind of everything's a crisis. Let's make these long-term so that it's that much easier for organizations. And Julia, great question about who makes the calls on grant-making processes. It's usually the staff. It depends on the type of foundation. You know, if we have family foundations, they probably have family members who are running that process. But what we're seeing with a lot of community-based foundations is a real call to look at all of that. I know Boulder County is currently doing that process of analyzing their grant making, really using an equity lens around all of it. Rose is in that process. Denver Foundation did that. So, you know, locally we've got folks who are really just kind of taking a step back to see how they can make their funding easier and more equitable.
And I think calls for changes in philanthropy had been on the table and being discussed and asked for well before the pandemic. But I think the pandemic just kind of sped those things up and really shined a light, you know, as it did in a lot of the inequities in our country. So it's sort of sped up that conversation and sped up those changes.
Yeah, I think, Megan, that's spot on. You're right, like all this was kind of bubbling to the surface, but then in a pandemic, it made it real. Like, okay, here's why we actually need to make these because our grantees are struggling.
Nia, I wonder if the changes in who is getting the philanthropy are driven by changes in who's giving the philanthropy, that more wealthy people, I mean, we've seen that the impact of the recession has been very bimodal. And I'm wondering whether we're seeing a bimodality in giving as well.
Yeah, I don't have specific data to back that up, but anecdotally, I think you're exactly right, Peter. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to jump into Boulder County because we have 13 minutes left. I don't know how this time goes that quickly, just like I don't know how I lost 20 years in that chart. So let's talk Boulder County philanthropy. First off, we have a very dense nonprofit sector here in Boulder County specifically. We've got a lot of international and national organizations that are headquartered here, in addition to just having robust nonprofits with direct local community services. We don't have an exact number, mostly because a lot of organizations can go kind of dormant without knowing that they've fully closed, that they've fully stopped operating. So this is an average of a couple of different numbers, but around 2,500 nonprofits. So if we take that number and look at it in comparison to our population, we have one nonprofit for every 130 people. The national average is one for every 1,800 people. So that means more competition for board members, more competition for volunteers, more competition for philanthropy, more competition for staff, right? It means that it's a highly competitive market here in Boulder County. And yet our giving lags. So our giving ratio, this means that in comparison to the income, we have a rate of giving of 2.6%. The rate for Colorado is 2.8 and the national rate is 3.1. So we are a full 0.5% below the national giving rate.
Can I ask if, like, how college students are counted? Do they count as part of this, and like what their income looks like?
They could. So one piece of data though, behind the methodology, this is one where it is only based on itemized donations. My guess is most college students aren't itemizing. And we also don't have this data post the new, the tax reform that happened in 2018. So this is pre that, when we actually had really good itemization data. Good question, Alexa.
Don't you think in Boulder County, there's a high percentage of people with DAPs or their own family foundation, so they're not itemizing either?
Well, they would. So when the funds go from their personal wealth into their donor advised fund or into their family foundation, that's when they get that deduction.
Yeah,
So
but that's only 1 year, and they might be using those funds for 20 years.
Yeah, well, this giving ratio has maintained for the prior 5 years that they collected it. So
Okay.
I think it's pretty safe to say that it's accurate. Any of you were around back in when the Community Foundation did the Megan, what was it called again? At the bouncing ball.
Culture of giving, is that culture of giving?
Yeah, what was the ball's name? Phil?
Oh, what there was the dude's name was Phil, and then the dog was Throppy.
Philanthropy. There we go. So, but the whole point around that was to increase philanthropy, increase giving in general, because there was this recognition that Boulder County has been lagging behind. If we got up to the national level, so if we were just giving that 3.1%, we would have an additional $32 million going into nonprofits. I'm sure any nonprofit executive who saw that number would think like, oh, I could do something with that. That would be very helpful. That is a huge
So
amount.
a giving ratio means a ratio of what?
Giving to overall income in the community at large.
Okay, so 2.6% of overall income in Boulder County is
Yep.
how much you give. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
Do you have a breakout for the city of Boulder versus the rest of the county?
I don't, unfortunately. I wish I did. I think that'd be quite telling, but they just give it, they give like major metro areas, and Boulder isn't large enough for that, or county. This is just a quick look at the breakdown by income level. And this we see basically nationwide. This is not unique to Boulder County, but those with lower income levels actually give at a higher rate. So we've got 2.9% in our 50 to 70,000 annually, goes down to 2.6, 2.3% for those who make 100 to 200K. For me, like that is the untapped potential right there. They're sitting probably pretty comfortable. They might not have 3 homes in the mountains, but they're doing okay, and they're giving a lot less of their income. And then we've got our 200 plus at 2.7%. So I would love to brainstorm reasons as to why this happens. Unfortunately, we just don't have time. So I'm going to give you my guesses. These are the 2 things that I hear about the most. We have fewer religious institutions, right? Less religious involvement means less giving. We saw how much philanthropy goes into religion. And we have high political involvement. We know we have a very, very civically active community. People are giving to political candidates, political campaigns, and so they're giving less philanthropically. Well, I got some news for you. This is 2010 data, so a little old, but it's the newest I could find. We had 233 faith communities with 122,000 adherents, so people actually involved in those faith communities, which is 4.3% of the population for that year. That same year, 37% of Coloradans, so fewer, were involved, while 48% of the overall population, so more. So it doesn't exactly address it, because we know Colorado as a whole still has a higher giving rate than we do, and yet as on whole have fewer adherents. So that doesn't exactly solve it for me. So then let's look at the political side. This is 2016. So again, the last year we had a big federal election, a presidential election that we have data for. Obviously, I can't wait to see the 2020 numbers. It's going to be so interesting. We had in Boulder County, again, about 17,000 individuals who gave to political campaigns, PACs, et cetera. This is all from FEC filings. I pulled this data just for you all, I want to say. The number of massive spreadsheets on my desktop right now is out of control. So we had 5.3% of the overall Boulder County population giving in 2016. That's actually below national standards as well. 15% of US households give politically, and we only had 5%. So again, these assumptions we have about Boulder County and why we might have lower philanthropic numbers, they just don't bear out in data for me. So the only thing I can think then is we just don't have a strong enough culture of philanthropy. We have wealth, we have young wealth, right? Like all these tech companies, and we're not talking to them about what they should be doing to support their community. And I think part of this, for me, and this is where I have no data, this is just me going off, is about us really connecting people into our communities when they move here, ensuring that they're embedded, and talk about this real responsibility to give. So in 2 minutes or less, I'm going to tell you how to fix all of this. No, I'm just kidding. But I'm going to give you a few tips of what we can do, especially here in Boulder County, to start shifting things. For you and your family, give and make sure you have a giving plan. Most households in America actually don't. So it ends up being, you know, whatever happens. Oh, your friend has a fundraiser on Facebook. They're doing a run. You give here, there. You sit on a board and you give. But we don't have real plans about it, which is funny because we have plans about a lot of the other financial things in our lives. So make sure that you actually have a giving plan so that you can be giving as much as possible. Look at how much you're giving locally versus nationally. Again, what we saw in 2020, our local nonprofits were the ones that were stepping up, that were ensuring the most marginalized populations in our community had the support that they needed. Give local whenever you can. I'm not saying anything bad about national organizations. Often we need that kind of big infrastructure, but really just look at how much you're giving locally versus nationally or internationally even, and see if you can maybe shift that ratio a little bit. Always be smart philanthropists. Don't restrict any of your giving. I cannot say that one strong enough. And again, 2020 was such a great indicator. If you restrict your giving and say, here's $1,000, but it can only be used for this, well, then we have a pandemic and this thing doesn't happen. Now I have $1,000 I can't use as a nonprofit. So send general operating dollars, let that nonprofit choose exactly how and when they're going to spend it, because we trust them. We know they're doing good work and we want them just to be able to use that however. Again, if we learned anything in 2020, it was that everything's going to change. And a lot of that might actually stay. So if you normally give to an organization at their annual gala, they might not ever have a gala again. We learned in 2020 that folks were willing to give on other platforms and that they were actually much more equitable. They allowed folks to engage with the organization without a high ticket price. It ensured that folks had access from all different walks of life. And so the traditional ways of fundraising actually might not come back, or at least won't come back in the same way. And that doesn't mean that they're not doing good work. So be open to those changes and focus on the work itself. Don't worry about overhead ratios. I've got a whole thing on that. If you have questions on why overhead is bullshit, is crud, you let me know. We can have that whole conversation. If you have some organizations that you really care about, ask them what they need. Most organizations will have a laundry list ready for you. They need volunteers. They need peer fundraisers. Those are actually a really, really important fundraising strategy. So if you've got one and you're thinking, what else can I do that maybe isn't more money from me? Ask them. I'm sure they'd love that. Be an ambassador. I often call this the Thanksgiving test. So if there are some nonprofits you really care about, if I show up at your Thanksgiving dinner, will your family and friends know about them? We're so quick to talk about the work we're doing, maybe about our family. We forget about these nonprofits that we truly care about. So talk about them. If you're on LinkedIn, add them to your profile. When you're at a happy hour, which someday we'll have again soon, and somebody says, what's going on? Talk about the great work they're doing. Build that into your spiel. And that just helps raise awareness. And with that, with 1 minute to spare, I'm going to turn it back to Josh. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Nia. informative, and I feel like we need like another session to dig even deeper. Can we bring you back for an even deeper dive into looking even closer at the Boulder County piece?
I think we can make that happen. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think, I mean, a lot of us here are examples of people who give and give generously. And so how are we pulling more people into that orbit? So I think that would be really helpful. But yeah. So thank you so much, everybody. As Nia said, we're going to send this slide deck out to you. And also I'll send a link. Another one of our partners, Brittany Wilson, who's the development director at YWCA. Nia and Brittany have a podcast called the Nonprofit Reframe Podcast, where she also gets to use colorful language like she treated us to towards the end of her presentation. And I think along with that podcast, as well as there's another blog that somebody else I think mentioned in the, I think it was you, Megan, is it Voulay? It's called Nonprofit AF, are two excellent resources for how to look at nonprofits different from the standard way that we look at them. So I think the Nonprofit Reframe podcast is fantastic, and I recommend people listening to it. I know there's a lot of questions. We'll hang around a little bit afterwards if people want to have that conversation. I just want to quickly say that our next two educational opportunities are in April. One is April 14th, and that's going to be looking at cultures of nonprofits and how to look at what a culture is. And that's with partners Roland Evans, Tim Rohr, and our lovely Renelle Randall, who's here as well. And then on April 28th, partner Eric Hansen, he spent close to 30 years in Russia working with nonprofits there. And so he's going to give a presentation on nonprofit culture in Russia, which should also be fascinating. So thank you all for joining. Please stay if you want more conversation. I'm going to hang out for a little bit as well. And if you have to go, please take care of yourselves and your families, and as our community continues to grieve together. So thank you for joining us today, and thank you, Nia.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nia.
Thank you, Megan. Help with that last slide there.
I had to do my very best to not get on a soapbox as well, and you did awesome.
It's hard. I have so many ready to pull out.
Right?
Megan, what angle would your soapbox be?
Oh my gosh. You know, really thinking about the calls for change in philanthropy, and thinking about, you know, how philanthropy was created in this country, why it was created, how it's continued to, you know, uphold some best practices that are really detrimental to the communities that we say that we are trying to work with. So it's like, I don't want to get on my soapbox now, but I mean, Nia touched on it. And I do think it's so frustrating to see that pie chart like hasn't shifted in decades. Like, it's still the same breakdown where individuals give more than foundations and corporate giving, even though foundations and corporate have millions or billions under their, you know, under their management. So that part's super frustrating as well. And then it's also, you know, the numbers of folks who give who are not in a higher income bracket, and they're giving more. And then the nonprofit sector has a tendency to focus more on high income bracket individuals when they're not the biggest givers. So I just think there's a lot that we can continue to do to look at ourselves as a sector and to change some of our best practices for the better.
That's such a good point. I mean, I feel like it's almost like they somehow started with like a good impulse, and then they became in the habit of acquiring funds. And then all of a sudden you become so focused on how much funds you're acquiring, and that then you lose sight of how those funds can be distributed in the most, you know, efficacious way. Similarly, as individuals, I feel like when I talk with younger people, I recommend, you know, and this is like as teenagers even, and I even do this with my son who's 6.5, you know, I ask him to take a percentage of his money that he's bringing in, you know, through chores or whatever, to be able to give away. And then how you increase that, because if you don't get that habit, that's a muscle you're never going to train. So as individuals and as foundations, I think we get in the habit of accumulating and not knowing how to get in the habit of distributing. So.
Nia, from a personally from a very personal level, you were talking about giving plan, right? So I often think about the organizations or the areas that are most important to me, and basically for me, it's education, preschools, things like I Have a Dream, so on. But community food share comes along, and I want to give to them, and this comes along and that comes along, so I give a few $100 here, a few $100 there. What's the most effective way to do this? I mean, it hurts to not give to these other organizations, but I don't know that it's as effective a way of really doing philanthropy.
Yeah, and there are a lot of different schools of thought around this stuff. And I don't know that I have like the solution. More than anything, though, I often recommend that people come up with their their primary giving budget. So the education giving, the community food shares, and then like your friends and family giving. So when a friend posts, I'm doing a run, you've got basically a separate budget for that. Because what we're seeing, unfortunately, is that people are actually now giving to those and depleting some of their primary giving budget. And so they're actually decreasing what should be going to these organizations that they truly care about and that are really making a difference. And so more than anything, I think it's just having discussions around those numbers. For folks earlier in their careers, I will often talk about, like, what do you do when you get a raise? Are you going to increase your philanthropy budget at the same ratio of your raise? Are you going to take money from the sale of an asset, right? So just kind of thinking about philanthropy in all the various aspects of your life instead of this other thing I do in December every year. But it's like part and parcel of all of your financial management.
And so another question, and then I'll shut up, is there's the gala kind of thing, and there's the direct donation. I mean, people go to galas and they spend all the money that it takes to put the gala on, and really what's left over is often not all that much. Are you better off to just not go to the damn gala and send them money?
Yes. Hard yes.
Yeah.
If I could wave my magic wand, we would be done with high-end events. And I'm not saying events in total. Like, I think there are some really great community building events and ways for organizations to engage with donors and volunteers in an in-person environment that doesn't have to cost $150 a plate.
Right.
I mean, that not only, like, just like Megan was saying, it changes how we do fundraising, because now we're catering to a certain type of donor. The net that we raise is significantly less than if those people had just directly donated to us. There's huge burnout on staff. And so we see fundraisers turn over constantly. A big part of that is events. So if we could get rid of those kind of events, I would be so happy. And I think our nonprofits would be doing much better because of it.
A lot of them have the non-event events.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how effective that is. I would guess they're not particularly effective, but I don't know.
I mean, they're typically just like an appeal, like anything else. We did see, though, in 2020, organizations creating online experiences that were much more accessible. Some might even have a ticket price, but they had a whole variety of ticket prices. And so they saw a huge increase in the overall audience that was able to actually be there and participate. Yeah. And so their fundraising did a lot better. Plus, their expenses were just way lower because of that kind of model.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Dennis, the YWC just had their gala, and as much as I do Nia, but they raised much more with the paddle race than they did last year. And I haven't talked to Brittany, but certainly there were lower ticket options than in previous years, which could have made a difference. And there was also not a big auction like there usually is, so you didn't have people potentially buying items and giving less to the paddle race. So the virtual event worked really great.
They almost doubled their net from the prior year. Yeah, it's huge.
Nia, I was just wondering if, and I don't know if this would be the Boulder Community Foundation, what is happening to sort of push this issue? I mean, you and I have talked about this since I joined SVP 4 years ago when the 2016, Community Foundation Trends report came out that I studiously studied and was so surprised to find this issue. And I just still am, hooked on why is this happening? And I still don't think we know. I mean, is anything happening and maybe the foundation to sort of have a community push on letting people know this and, trying to prod people along or something?
Not right now, but I mean, also for full support of the Community Foundation in a lot of ways. They've had 3 disasters they've responded to in the last year and been deploying funds for. So, but as far as I know, they don't have any like broader philanthropic push planned. And it doesn't fall into their current strategic plan in any way that I can see either.
This is kind of very specific, but it seems that we don't get a lot of donations from our audience. It seems as though it's just speculation, is they think the donation is by attending our events. But of course, that's just a fraction of what it takes to actually hold them. And I don't know how to convert that or change that.
Yeah, well, part of it really is starting off with that conversation and having it very openly. I worked with a client last year that was providing trainings, and similarly, people thought that like the training expense fully covered it. And so we just started adding messaging in, like making sure people know we're a nonprofit and we actually subsidize these trainings. And so your donation can help this be accessible to other people. That's how we keep our prices low. And so we just started like peppering that messaging into all the things they were doing, because the reality was, and we did a survey, people didn't know. They thought expenses were fully covered. So why would they give? And we just had to educate them.
Yeah, and I don't have the numbers, but maybe you know, Nia, but like, isn't it usually like the 1 or 2 top reasons why people don't give is that they weren't asked?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh.
They weren't asked. And then in those settings, they aren't given the direct means. So it's like, when you go home, figure out how to give us money. And it's like, no.
Right.
We need to have it right in that moment, an easy way for people to transfer money over to us if they feel called to. Hi, Josh's son. And Julia, I just saw your chat. Yes, total oversight on my part. I'm so sorry. Introductions would have been great.
I think the oversight's on my part.
So we're going on 36.
No, I think it's on my part.
We all agree it's Dennis's fault. So Julia, sorry about that.
Great culture of accountability here, folks.
Well, Nia, thank you again.
Yeah,
thank you. And it's a real tremendous effort to have done this given everything that's happened in the last couple of days. So I really appreciate you sharing what you shared. So
my pleasure.